what is your philosophy within and without art? Does philosophy as an idea often deflate under its own under these tombs? And I want to talk about characterization as philosophy too, because I think the best philosophy I've read has often been when a character is well rendered in a book, as opposed to the typical philosophical tombs that we read.
Okay, tomes, another of your famous mispronunciations. Um,
Petter cliche.
yeah, um, I don't have any real personal philosophy. I mean that I express on a personal level. I'm a pragmatist. I do what is needed. I think, I try to treat people well because I want to be treated well and fairly. I try to stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves, which has led me to sometimes have to either exit jobs by my choice or not. Um, as far as characterization, if, for example, if I take a character like the Norwegian in either book that I have, people should be able to see parts of themselves in a character like that. Obviously, if I'm talking about an evil person, you can't, you have to exaggerate in the sense, not that character, the Norwegian, lives in his life, in his diegetic universe, unexaggerated. But if you're able to see the impulses that he talks about, things that he observes, and why he does this kind of thing, or Big Frank, or Bit von Reingold, as over the top as he can be, then you're able to say, well, if I can understand that, I may not have experienced things to their degree, but it gives me a template from which I can then ratiocinate and parallax my own behaviors upon. So characterization, even if it's exaggerated, say in a Tom Sawyer, not Huckleberry Finn, for example, by Mark Twain, if a bigoted person, if a racist, even in the late 1800s, had read that, he or she may be able to say, "Boy, I I feel some of those things too. Maybe it's not good for me to think that black people are apes or scum." You even see that with that Cincinnati kid that got into the gorilla thing. The mother is an idiot. She deserves every bit of excoriation. But then there, of course, there are these trolls out there that are saying because the woman and the kid were black, that, oh, the kid was trying to get into the gorilla cage because blacks are gorillas, and they're making all these kinds of racist nonsense shit. So this woman who deserves excoriation is excoriated for utterly the wrong reasons by a significant portion. But getting back to my own philosophy, characterization helps you understand bits of yourself uh, within the other character, but it doesn't really, it doesn't really, uh, it's not anything that's based upon philosophy. I'm just finishing up this spy book, and I think this spy book is so relentless and so withering in its critiques of the character, but it doesn't wallow in it. The character goes through things, you hear the things, there are things that are left unsaid, but a reader should be able to pick up that this character, and this character in almost 300,000 words is plumbed probably more, as much or more so than any other character I've done and any other character that's ever been written. And uh, but you know, there's no philosophy that the book has. I'm not trying to make a philosophical point. Just say, here's this character. He's a spy, but I'm trying to. What I'm doing is saying, well, obviously we know that the James Bond type spy thing is just silly. But even real life spies are going to do things, and this book gets into some of that by trying to paint a very broad portrait over the course of 80 years that this character supposedly has lived, from the 2016 of the now, when the book begins and ends, to when he was born. So,
Very interesting. I've noticed that as I've read kind of the arc of your development, that the span of years is getting more and more. That's something that you usually don't see. I've noticed most of the most successful published novels or what have you, they take a small time frame and they get deeply into it. But the expansive years thing, that is always usually a sign of bad writing, whereas what you're doing is making it into great writing.
well, My next book on Gorgeous George is probably going to be set over a 4 or 5 year period. I think I mentioned I'm going to have maybe a dozen or so long conversations, first person from George to key characters in his development. But the basic thrust of the book is going to be radically different in that it's going to be either his first or second wife talking about his career. It's probably going to be his first wife, set between maybe 47 and 1952, about a 4 or 5 year period, maybe shorter, when he's going through some kind of a crisis, or the wife is going through some kind of a crisis. And she's going to be describing small little vignettes chronologically, sort of like Mr. and Mrs. Bridge books by Evan S. Connell. So you're going to have the wife's point of view in these small little vignettes, and then contrast it with the conversations of the Gorgeous George character to give his portrait. But I don't know what I'm going to have to create some fictional crisis in his or her life that's going to be the spur of the book. But I don't know what it'll be. But that's going on. I mean, I've done books, and there will come a time. The Genghis Khan book, the Khan books that I'm probably going to do sometime in the next few years, will focus on just a 2 or 3 year span. There's no way I would want to even endeavor to do a whole novel on Genghis Khan's rise in life.
You think something like that could be done, though?
Oh, sure, it
The
could
whole
be
Mongol
done.
Empire?
I mean, I could do it if I was moved to do that. But since I've done big, expansive books, in order to do that, I would have to probably research a lot more. Whereas when you focus down, I'm going to have the accoutrements of the Mongol era there. But, it's not something that's going to have to be historically accurate in terms of, if I'm not going to go into extensive description of Mongol, warfare, what stuff. I'll have little bits here and there, but it's going to be about the relationships, and that's the way that with historical works it's best to go, because you can look in history books for, oh, this is when the M27 repeating rifle was developed that helped conquer the West against the Apaches or something. But that has no.
Poetry seems a very good vessel for condensing long terms of
Yeah.
years. American Imperium, for instance, it condenses like the whole history of America and then what could be possibly arising from America too. Whereas if you put that in a novel, it's usually best to. I notice historical figures make very good background characters, but not necessarily if you put them in the front. It seems like such a standard thing to do, to take, say Richard Nixon and put him at the front of a character and make him the main and central drive, rather than having, say, a background figure that is usually left out as the main character and then Richard Nixon just in the background.
Yeah, the main characters of most of my books are total fiction creations, sometimes based upon people I know, sometimes not. The Gorgeous George will be an exception, but Gorgeous George, not that much is known other than this book that I'm reading of his life, and other than a few little online YouTube segment documentaries. Not that much is known, so there's a good way to create an alternate Gorgeous George to what little is known.
Just as a tangent, Dan, in Norwegian in the Family, you have several celebrities that are peppered throughout the whole of the narrative. You'll take the ambiguities of that character and you'll go on that tangent instead of going, say, Andy Warhol was a poser and whatnot. But if you went on that tangent, that would be quite obvious. It's more the veneer of what's behind the act that's dealt with rather than the act itself.
Yeah, Andy Warhol is basically Bit's supporting character. He's the Robin to Bit von Reingold's Batman in that book. I reversed that in this spy book. Bit von Reingold, I think at the end of, well, in '64 I mentioned a character, Michael Nur, and I think I mentioned Michael Nur at the end of A Norwegian in the Family in the last book. He was a real life character who wrote a book called Sex Life of the Gods that I read as a kid. It was bad. It was bad softcore porno, pulp fiction, but he's one of the main secondary characters in this book, in that he has 2 or 3 scenes where he's going through existential crises, where I'm using a bit of my own life worries in, and he's basically not been allowed to succeed nor fail because of Bit von Reingold, and he has a very tenuous relationship with Bit, who's totally oblivious to the things that this guy is going through. So Bit von Reingold is in this book basically to help define this Michael Nur character, who's a real world figure, whereas Bit is a total fiction.